This is it. Ukraine is out of options. The collective West has now basically made it clear in article after article, publication after publication, anonymous source after anonymous source, not so anonymous source after anonymous source, from Mark Milley to even Joe Biden himself, talking about how Ukraine, the aid to Ukraine is no longer guaranteed. We have Kevin McCarthy making a huge political scene now as the elections, the presidential elections, and of course the congressional elections come closer and closer, 2024. But there's a bigger problem for Ukraine, and that is that the wonder weapons, the NATO arsenal, the United States and its collective West vassals that they've supplied to Ukraine, it hasn't been effective. It's been burned through. There is nothing left. And so what that has meant is that the counteroffensive that Ukraine has waged for over 3 months now has also burnt out. It's fizzled out. It really has been a disaster of epic proportions when you think about the massive losses, upwards of 66,000 killed in action. But now the collective West is starting to communicate quite clearly to us. And here's what The Economist had to say. Western help for Ukraine is likely to diminish next year. So we're talking about 2024. There is a weapons shortage and a munition shortage, and in some quarters, goodwill. So this is The Economist. This is a breaking story. The end keeps receding. There was a time when some Ukrainian officials, having halted Russia's army outside of Kiev, thought it would take only a few more months to bring the war to a conclusion. Most of the active combat actions will have finished by the end of this year, said Lieutenant General Kirill Budanov, head of military intelligence, in May 2022. By last November, shortly after a spectacular Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv, Vladimir Harlov, a deputy defense minister at the time, was still expecting a swift victory. My feeling is that by the end of the spring, it will be all over. And that was the vaunted spring offensive. It was supposed to happen. It was supposed to build off of the supposed territorial gains in Kharkov, Kherson, etc., to bolster that summer offensive of supposed victory, and it fell flat on its face. So, in fact, Ukraine's counteroffensive did not even begin until June. Far from hastening the war's end, it has demonstrated just how long the fighting could drag on. Ukrainian forces, stymied by Russian minefields and other defensives, had inched forward on foot. The deployment of reserves and spiffy Western weapons has not yet yielded any big breakthroughs. Wet weather and a shortage of ammunition will probably bring the Ukrainian advance, such as it is, to a halt by late October, if not earlier. Another fighting season beckons. We must prepare ourselves for the long war in Ukraine, warned Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, on September 17th. It'll take a considerable length of time to militarily eject all 200,000 plus Russian troops out of Russian-occupied Ukraine, said Mark Milley, America's top general, that same day. America insists it will stay for as long as it takes. As Joe Biden, the president, has said several times this year. Britain, France, Germany, and other allies have all used the same phrase. As ironclad as these pledges sound, they depend on two uncertain variables. One is the West's ability to furnish Ukraine's army with enough ammunition and weapons. The other is the political will to keep handing them over. So again, we are talking about the fact that not only is the collective West out of weapons and really out of the ability to produce enough weapons to push back Russia, but they're also out of the political conditions to make such a push even possible. So let's start with the first. Russian defense industry moved onto a war footing in the last quarter of 2022. And British officials say that Russia can now produce around 200 tanks per year, twice as many as they previously assumed. Mr. Connolly says that refurbished tanks included, so this is Richard Connolly, an expert in Russia's economy. He says the true figure is probably 500 to 800 per year. Western sanctions are not crimping output much, he adds, with crucial components such as semiconductors smuggled in via Hong Kong and Central Asia. So, this is just, again, shows the failure of the sanctions. Countries they say smuggled, but really a lot of these countries and regions, right, Hong Kong, part of China, Central Asia, a lot of these countries are close with Russia. They're not following the sanctions. In principle, Ukraine's friends should have no trouble helping it outgun Russia. The combined GDP, so this is what they always say, right? Look how big the NATO members are. They're 12 times that of Russia's GDP. even accounting for Russia's lower prices. The difference is that Russia is willing to spend much more heavily on war, now taking up 40% of the national budget so far as military spending, far in excess of Western levels. But this is also a misnomer. Here's the economist trying to dupe you. Russia may be spending a larger portion of its GDP on war, but the combined military budget of the EU and the United States is in the close to $1 trillion. So, and that's just what we know publicly. So that's a misnomer. So another issue, two snags, right, about how to address the imbalance in investing in arms production is cost. So Estonia spends 5,000 to 6,000 on a new artillery shell on every new artillery shell, says a senior civil servant in the country's defense. That is relatively cheap by NATO standards, he notes, but Russia, he says, spends 60,000 rubles or $620. The vast difference is largely down to cheaper labor and materials and lower costs and lower profit margins for arms manufacturers, most of which are state-owned. Inflation is exacerbating the problem. Prices for equipment and ammunition are shooting up, complained Admiral Rob Bauer, NATO bigwig, on September 16th. The second is timing. After a slow start, Russia has reached a race pace and they're in gear now. They're now going to start churning out stuff at the rate approximating what they need. American and European investments in new capacity, having started later, will not yield extra supplies until second half of 2024 to 2025, giving Russia more time to mobilize, build new defenses, and pin down Ukrainian forces. Let's look at artillery shells. The good news is that American and European production is soaring. Good news, right? Amazing. Actually, though, the output has risen from 168,000 shells in the spring to 336,000 today. It will continue to rise. In European production, between them, America and Europe should comfortably produce nearly 2 million shells that next year. But the trouble is, it's barely enough to keep up. So they try to delay you from the reality here. Russia will produce 1 million to 2 million shells next year, according to British estimates. That is on top of a stock of around 5 million shells refurbished. Well, Ukraine has none. Right? Ukraine is out of shells, and they're only going to get maybe 2 million shells, maybe, and not even 2 million. The total the U.S. and Europe are going to produce. Total, they're not going to give it all to Ukraine, but they'll give them some. But Russia has already outpaced them 2 to 3 times right now. So that should allow the 5 million shells for Russia to fire 15,000 rounds a day. That is roughly on par with Ukraine's heightened consumption during its counteroffensive, according to people familiar with the data. But Ukraine can probably sustain that tempo for only a few more months, while Russia can sustain it for the rest of the year and onward. So they're going to talk about how there's borrowing being done, South Korea, and that the problems may ease, but there's also politics, right? So they say, oh, well, the year after next, if everything goes according to plan, then we'll have the shells, we'll have the weapons, etc. But politics. In Europe, the political winds seem favorable to Ukraine. A year from now, though, let's see. So in June and July, 64% of Europeans favor military aid to Ukraine. Strong support in not just in countries with a longstanding suspicion of Russia, such as Sweden, but also more distant member states like Portugal. But then you have hard right parties like Marine Le Pen in France and the AfD, where, they could gain steam. Olaf Scholz has been mindful in Germany of anti-war sentiment, notably within his own party. He dithered for months before agreeing to send Leopards to Ukraine. He still refuses to send long-range Taurus missiles, even though Britain and France have given Ukraine comparable weapons. Mr. Scholz now has realized that public skepticism is mushy. As soon as he sends a new weapon, approval broadly follows. So here they're trying to say, well, he should do it anyway, but there's obviously concern. So Macron, who provoked crumbling in Kiev last year over his frequent phone calls with Vladimir Putin, his Russian counterpart, over the hesitation to send weapons, is now among the most gung-ho, and that a lot of French supposedly support this as well. But these are all polls that we don't know how good they really are. And so while they're saying that Europe is in really good shape to support more aid to Ukraine, the real big pusher for this is the United States. And I've said again and again, with the Republicans, with Kevin McCarthy, there's a lot of uncertainty there. So Ukraine aid is becoming a partisan issue, they say, and the prospects are less certain. If Trump wins, who knows what's going to happen? You never can predict what Donald Trump will do. And so there's a lot of interest to slow this conflict down in Washington. So, well, money makes some sense here, right? It's a money problem. It's going to be a debate, and now it's becoming more and more a debate as the United States, as the biggest supplier of aid to Ukraine, has political problems, political divisions over this issue. It's more than that, right? It's more than that. It is about whether this is something worthwhile in doing. America has been the fulcrum of the Allied effort to support Ukraine, chairing regular meetings at which donations of weapons are pledged and coordinated at Ramstein, an American military base in Germany. It has provided diplomatic cover for other countries' aid. For example, to Germany, to Schultz, who insisted that he would not allow German-made Leopard tanks to be sent to Ukraine unless Biden sent M1 Abrams first. And so, in some cases, Europeans have sent arms to Ukraine and they understand that they will receive new American weapons to replace the donated ones. With these security guarantees underwritten by nuclear weapons have given Europeans the confidence to stand up to Russian threats. America has provided vital intelligence that has helped Ukraine find and destroy high-value targets. Substituting for this organization assistance would be a Herculean task, but may be unavoidable. The assumption of the West was, and I think everyone had been unspoken about this, was that to give them everything we can, and they will go on this one large offensive. Whatever happens in the end, we will settle for that. That was the plan. A new one is required, he says, involving not just more arms, but also more technology to offset Russia's advantages. Above all, change in mentality is needed. This is exactly what a war of attrition is about. Convince the West that we can outsuffer you, we can outfight you, we can outlast you. So that is the problem. The problem is the war of attrition. It is the fact that Russia has all of these advantages and that it's going to grind political will. And while the Economist, right, they say, when they say this, when Western mainstream media talks about it like this, you have to understand that the issue here is that even with more and more support going to Ukraine in terms of military weaponry, it's not enough. And that is having a huge impact on the political will of especially the United States, because a war of attrition is going to be incredibly difficult to sustain and could be subject to political headwinds. And that is why The Economist is sounding the alarm. The end of NATO's wonder weapons is coming soon. And so I want to show you what Scott Ritter had to say to Sputnik, all right, about the attackums and about this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde approach that Biden has taken on Ukraine weapons, because it underscores this problem. And here's what Scott Ritter had to say.
The Biden administration seems to be going through a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type phase when it comes to the nature of the weapons that it's willing to provide to Ukraine. A year ago, the Biden administration was very reticent about providing certain categories of weapons out of fear of creating the potential of an escalation between the United States, between NATO and Russia over Ukraine. The last thing the United States wanted, or so the Biden administration said, was a direct war with Russia. Today, all of those inhibitions seem to have been swept away. We see the United States providing M1 Abrams tanks. We see the United States authorizing the delivery of F-16 fighters. And now the United States is considering to provide Ukraine with the ATACMS long-range missile system, or the guided multiple launch rocket system, a 45-mile range rocket system delivered by the HIMARS system that has extreme accuracy and can deliver cluster munitions. This, of course, follows on the heels of the decision by the Biden administration made earlier this year to provide Ukraine with the cluster variant of the 155 millimeter artillery shell. Now, why is the Biden administration doing this? What's clear is that it's not doing this to assist the Ukrainians on the battlefield. The Ukrainians, according to Russian President Vladimir Putin have suffered 71,000 casualties over the course of the last 4 months in a failed counteroffensive effort. And there's nothing about the nature of these weapons that would improve Ukraine's chances on the battlefield. These weapons that are being provided to provide Ukraine with the potential of doing harm to Russia. The ATACMS missile is being provided, simply put, to strike the Crimea bridge, to destroy that bridge, to enable Ukraine to strike targets deep in the Russian rear area, airfields, command posts, logistics. This is a dramatic escalation of the conflict. Now, why is the Biden administration doing this? Frankly speaking, it's out of an act of desperation. Look, anybody who looks at the situation on the ground in Ukraine knows that Ukraine is losing, Russia is winning, and literally there's nothing that can be done to prevent a Russian victory. The provision of ATACMS rockets, the GMLRS rocket system isn't going to change the outcome on the battlefield. What it will do is provide Ukraine the opportunity to inflict more harm on Russia. And the United States is betting that Russia will say, we don't want that to happen, that Russia is concerned about the domestic political consequences of Ukraine striking targets in the Russian rear, Ukraine destroying the Crimea bridge. We'll see how this unfolds. My bet is that Russia, a nation that has a history of absorbing 27 million dead in the cause of defeating fascism, defeating Nazism, isn't going to yield to any threats being made by the United States, but we'll find out.
Yes, we will indeed find out. But, you know, and that couples with this, there's this contrast here, and it's Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. I mean, I think that's an apt, a really apt description here, because you have the economists on the one hand saying, we may have to slow down here because we're at a disadvantage. Russia has the artillery advantage. It has the weaponry advantage right now. And at the same time, all of Joe Biden's moves, all of the United States' moves, including what may happen out of this meeting, and it's almost a certainty that 24 billion more in military aid and other kinds of aid is going to go to Ukraine. It means that there is more, while there's more impetus to slow down, it's not slowing down right now, that it is a constant escalation. But that escalation is not the primary force here. It's not the primary factor, because every escalation now has an air of ineffectiveness. It is not successful. It's not going to breed the kind of success that the United States and, of course, its NATO vassals, its European vassals are hoping it will bring. It's not going to bring that kind of success. And that is where there is this almost tearing apart and ripping apart of the fabric of the legitimacy of this conflict, of this proxy war altogether. Russia certainly has the advantages here. Now they're admitting it. Now the collectivists and the neocons are admitting these advantages, which have been a reality for quite some time, if they weren't a reality from the very beginning. The strategy was to throw everything that the United States, that NATO had at Ukraine, so that Ukraine would win, and that would be the end of it. Russia would fall. And I do believe, and I say this all the time, I believe that the calculation was that the economic war was going to undo Russia. It would undo it politically, and that would mean Russia would have to pull out. I don't think they ever thought Ukraine was going to plant its flag on the Donbass and say, we've thrown out Russia. Russia will no longer lay claim to this territory, which the majority of the citizens there and civilians there want Russia to be leading and presiding over. I don't think that was ever going to happen. That's because I don't think the people of the Donbass, first of all, were ever going to stop fighting anyway. But they had hoped that Russia itself, the Russian Federation, the Russian military, would have to pull out because of issues, domestic issues, economic issues, political issues that would arise from this conflict. And it never happened, and it's not going to happen. So with all of that said, the United States can't but escalate, while at the same time, the collective West as a whole, and the United States especially, I think the United States is really driving this force, not because it's a peacenik, not because it wants peace, but because it needs Europe to be the attack dog. It needs Europe to maintain almost like a Zelensky-like fervor about this conflict. But the United States is the one that wants to look like a rational actor. So it's going to be the one, as the hegemon, as the one who is dominating and domineering over Europe and Ukraine. It's going to be the one to advise and to counsel and say, we need to slow this down. It's a war of attrition now. And guess what? You're not going to get anything that you need for another year, 2 years. Who knows? Who knows? Because I think that the Economist article, along with what Scott Ritter had to say, perfectly provide that contrast of they're going to throw everything to you, everything that they've got to you. It's not going to make a difference. And at the same time, they're going to be telling Ukraine, that's the you, going to be telling Ukraine that it's time to slow down. It's a war of attrition. Please don't do anything rash or stupid. Don't get yourself eliminated before we can make the promises, or at least fulfill the promises that we've continued to make to you from the very beginning. So, this is becoming a real problem. And here you have the desperation really setting in. And I think Scott Ritter was correct that these are all acts of desperation. Here you have on September 18th, the U.S. offered Pakistan IMF sweetener for Ukraine weapons. Washington was angered by Imran Khan's government for its aggressively neutral stance on Ukraine, The Intercept reported. So essentially, the United States brokered a loan from the International Monetary Fund to crisis-ridden Pakistan in exchange for a secret arms deal. The Intercept reported on September 18th, or on Sunday, and this was reported on September 18th. The outlet, citing sources with knowledge of the arrangement and government documents on both sides, claimed that the weapons are meant to supply the Ukrainian military in its ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So from the summer of 22 to the spring of 2023, there was supposed to be an arms deal between the U.S. and Pakistan. And the exchange was facilitated by Global Military Products, a subsidiary of Global Ordnance, a company seemingly connected to Ukraine. The leaked documents show that American and Pakistani contracts, licensing, and requisition documents related to U.S. broker deals to buy Pakistani military weapons for Ukraine, according to The Intercept. So, again, I mean, this is similar to what happened when it was revealed by the New York Times that South Korea was supposed to send its stored ammunition, Israel as well, to Ukraine. This is how desperate the situation is. And they're going to continue to do things like this. They're going to continue to twist anybody they can who the United States and the West has given weapons to, NATO has given weapons to, give it to Ukraine while we work on slowing things down. But the situation is really bad. And the Economist could only skim the surface because they don't want to tell you the truth. The mainstream media doesn't want to tell you the truth. And here's the cold hard truth. This is from Business Insider. By no means a friend of Russia or a friend of peace. This is from Business Insider. They're saying that Ukraine is firing 7,000 rounds a day, a fraction of the 60,000 shells Russia was firing earlier this year. Ukraine lags far behind Russia in its use of artillery shells, according to CNN. Russia fired 60,000 shells a day earlier this year, 2023, while Ukraine fires now just 7,000. Artillery fire has been a hallmark of Russia's 18-month war in Ukraine. They're burning through artillery shells. Ukraine is ammunition at a rate of 7,000 rounds per day, still a much lower rate that Russia was using during the height of its military efforts earlier in the year. Ukraine is firing 6,000 to 7,000 rounds a day compared to Russia's rate of 20 to 60,000 at the peaks of its barrages this year. And that continues. It's not always that high, but it is still much higher than what Ukraine is doing. It wants to fire more than 10,000 rounds a day, according to CNN, which would remain far below Russia's military efforts. But to reach that level, Kiev would need about 1.5 million artillery shells a year, which, as The Economist reported, that's not possible because it's going to take at least a year for the United States and Europe to produce 2 million. So that means Ukraine is effed. They're screwed. They don't have what they need. This constant exchange of fire is depleting Ukraine's stockpile and worrying its allies about its own arsenals. As of July, the U.S. had committed sending more than 2 million artillery rounds to Ukraine, while the EU has approved plans to send 250,000 rounds. But again, a lot of this means these commitments and these pledges does not mean that they are available. It means that they will be produced and sent. And as The Economist said, as of now, that's not going to happen for another year. Does Ukraine have that amount of time? Probably not. So what the United States, what the collective West, the neocon foreign policy establishment, the imperialists, what they want to do is they want to keep this going as long as possible while making a shift in the public perception, the public image, the public relations of this conflict in order to open up the option for some kind of frozen conflict. And when I say frozen, I don't necessarily mean ceasefire. But what I mean is that this conflict could be frozen in place and that there may be fighting on the front lines. It may actually wind down because of the weather. And that will be the opportunity. When the weather in Ukraine turns poor, it'll be an opportunity to then shift the narrative because there'll be less fighting, less killing. And that narrative can be shifted to, well, Ukraine has done the best it could. Ukraine has won. It has won a battle of morale. It has taken on the Russian giant. It made gains in the past, and you've seen the reports on Zaporozhye and all constantly talk about Ukraine having made some kind of gains recently, but there's no confirmation of such gains. That will continue for some time, and then the United States and the collective West can say, well, it's good that it's slowed down now. The terrain is not there. We need to regroup. We need to produce more weapons. It's not the time now to just win this war altogether. We need to freeze the conflict. The weather is not good. And we will essentially declare Ukraine victorious and that our efforts were noble. And let's see how long it takes to restore Ukraine to fighting force. It could take more than a year. And if it takes more than a year, then you never know if the conflict will continue on in the same way again. That is where this conflict has seemingly been going for quite some time. We know that Vladimir Putin, Russia, they are not in a hurry to settle this conflict. They're not interested in a negotiated settlement at this moment for very good reasons. For one, Ukraine and its NATO backers, its U.S. masters, have not shown that they have any interest in meeting any of Russia's security guarantees, its concerns. None of that is on the table. There is conversations between between Russian and United States intelligence, CIA and SVR, but we don't know the extent of what that means and whether that will lead to direct talks between Ukraine and Russia. Antony Blinken, after his visit to Kiev September 6th, he went on ABC, and what did he say? Ukraine's ready to talk, which I think was really code for we need to begin to talk. And Russia, of course, will be the one who needs to come to the table as a good faith actor, because they can't let go of the narrative. They can't admit that they've lost. But the reality is that the neocons, the imperialists, the military contractors are winning, but the overall strategy of the collective West has been a failure. Ukraine was not the proxy they thought it would be. It was not the guarantor of victory over Russia they thought it was going to be. And so they overplayed their hand, and now they are paying the price. And we are going to see more and more admissions. We're going to see the wonder weapons for Ukraine dry up for the simple fact that they just aren't there. We're going to see the United States and NATO and the collective West play a game of chicken where, on the one hand, they talk a language of force and escalation and send aid package after aid package, while those aid packages get smaller and while the weapons get fewer. And that's already been happening. And if you watch Brian Berletic and others, you know that that's been happening. But on the other side, the political side, which is of even more importance and of interest to this program, on the political side, I think we're going to see a quieter narrative, a narrative that says Ukraine, they did a good job. Now is not the time to fight any further. The weather is poor. Ukraine struck a lot of victories. It's especially the moral victory. All of the aid was justified. Now we just wait and see to when we can get back to the business of waging war on Russia. That will be, I believe, how the United States and its collective West vassals explain away their defeat but defeat it is. And Russia will continue to pursue its objectives, and that will place a lot of pressure on the collective West to decide and make a real decision. Can it sustain the level of support? Can it maintain a war of attrition? The facts say no, but the collective West is going to try, and that Russia is not going to back down, not because it wants war, not because it thinks war is grand, or as Zelensky said, it wages a war every other decade or every decade, whatever he said at the UN General Assembly. All of that is nonsense, and it obscures the reality of what the United States and its vassals have done around the world. But the truth is that Russia wants to win, and Russia will win, because Russia has a huge stake in what happens in this region. It is right on in Russia's backyard, and now many of these territories are part of the Russian Federation because their civilians wanted it, their residents wanted it, the people there wanted it, the ethnic Russians wanted it, the Russian speakers wanted it, and many others wanted it. And they wanted it because the reality always was that Ukraine was a terrorist proxy regime born by a coup that empowered the most malignant, diseased forces on the planet, neo-Nazis, real, just genuine, old-time Nazis, and all of their backers and supporters. And there's nothing more repugnant than that. There's nothing more cruel and dictatorial and oppressive than living under a regime that is constantly attacking you for being Russian or even aligned with Russia. That is why the reality has shaped out the way it has. And this is ultimately why Russia will not back down. And so it'll really be on Russia's terms, but it's really going to be up to the collective West to settle on Russia's terms. And that is just an existential problem. It is an absolute NO. And that's why we are where we are. That's why we're in a quagmire. And that's why Ukraine is going to continue to diminish in terms of its prospects. And that's why this war is effectively lost. Not on the Russian side, but on the United States, NATO's, and of course, its Ukrainian puppet. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.